back to the daily grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
Holy flying flipping flapjacks. Full-time family, I gotta take a moment and give a huge shout out and a thank you to Aaron Burrell for the $100 donation. I wish I would have known that before I made this video. I went to upload these predictions and then I was checking my email on the way and realized that Aaron Burrell has sent a $100 donation. So thank you very much to Aaron Burrell, aka the fucking GOAT, aka Xerxes, the God King. What the fuck you time at? Full-time family. Hey, I don't know how to say thank you enough to this dude. You guys know full-time family, but a lot of the stuff, I mean, you guys know I'm gonna be doing this with or without donations, but Aaron Burrell, man, really fucking comes through big time, man. So thank you very much for the continued support. You, sir, are Xerxes, a fucking God King, a God amongst men. Everybody else, thank you as well just for even watching this video if you're watching. So with that being said, let's get into these UFC Fight Night Lyoto Machida versus Eric Anders predictions. See you in a little bit. And we are back with the UFC Berlin preview and predictions. This will be a 6-fight main card on Fox Sports 1, and it's going to be held in Belém, Brazil. Now, the main event of this card is going to be between former UFC middleweight champion Lyoto Machida and Eric Anders, who is undefeated 10-0. If you don't know much about Eric Anders, he transitioned to MMA from playing college football. He won a national title with Alabama and transitioned to MMA. Now he's undefeated, and he's looking to take on Lyoto Machida, one of the legends and veterans of the middleweight division. This is perfect matchmaking in my opinion. I'll explain why when we get there. Man, this fight is almost a coin flip as far as the main event is concerned. But we're going to start off with the first fight of the main card on this preview and predictions, which is between Thiago Santos and Anthony Smith. Now, every single fight on this main card I am excited for. I mean, even the next two fights we're going to talk about, they don't have as much name recognition, but all of these fights are going to be great. Now, you know what, I'm just going to start with Anthony Smith first. There's a lot to talk about on these fights as far as Valentina Shevchenko is making her 125-pound debut versus undefeated Priscilla Cachoeira. We'll talk about that when we get there. That fight is this close to not being sanctioned, but we'll get there. We'll get there in time. So we're going to start off with Anthony Smith, who is 28-12 in his professional career. So he has 40 professional fights, and he's 4-2 in the UFC. He's riding a 3-fight KO TKO streak, but he's coming most recently off of a victory over Hector Lombard. Anthony Smith, although on a 3-fight winning streak, and all 3 of those being TKO or KOs, was getting outstruck and losing the takedown battle in his last 2 fights, but was able to score a 3rd round TKO or KO in both of the fights. So Anthony Smith is on a 3-fight finishing streak, but both of his last 2 wins were comebacks. Now he's going to be fighting Thiago Santos, who's also on a 3-fight KO TKO streak, but he hasn't really been in trouble in his fights. He's really just been winning in dominant fashion as far as the UFC fight metrics are concerned. Thiago Santos is 16-5 overall, so a little bit less experienced as far as overall mixed martial arts, but he actually has more UFC experience as he's 8-4 in the UFC. Thiago Santos is also, as I said, riding a 3-fight KO TKO spree, coming off of a 1st round KO over Jack Hermanson. Thiago Santos has outstruck all 3 of his opponents before finishing them, unlike Anthony Smith. So I'm going to be picking Thiago Santos to win this fight. He's got more UFC experience. He's been in the octagon with Gegard Mousasi and other higher level UFC middleweights, while also finishing his opponents quicker and more efficiently than Anthony Smith, who was losing in striking and takedowns before finishing his last 2 opponents. It's pretty crazy to me that Thiago Santos is unranked. It seems like he should at least be fighting a ranked opponent, as he's been on a tear lately, and his only losses in the last 3 years are to Gegard Mousasi, one of the best middleweights of all time, and then also getting caught in a submission to Eric Spicely. But other than that, I believe he's like 7-2 in the last 3 or 4 years. So I believe Thiago Santos gets this win and then fights a ranked opponent in his next fight if he is able to get the win over Anthony Smith. Anthony Smith is definitely a warrior, battle tested, and always has a chance to win the fights, as we saw from his last 2 fights. He could be losing the first 2 rounds of this fight and then knock out Thiago Santos. It's a very real possibility, but I'm picking Thiago Santos to get the victory. Moving to the next fight, Timothy Johnson, the number 15th ranked heavyweight in the world, versus Marcelo Gom, another undefeated young heavyweight from Brazil. So Marcelo Golm is 6-0. He's 1-0 in the UFC, so he won his UFC debut via submission versus a guy that had no wins in the UFC. So although he's 6-0 and undefeated, he's still a little inexperienced as far as most UFC fighters are concerned. Now this is the heavyweight division, you have to keep in mind, which means anybody can go down at any moment with the the heavy shots that these heavyweights throw. So with that being said, Marcelo Golm has never fought anyone on Timothy Johnson's level prior to the UFC, and his one UFC opponent didn't even have a win in the UFC to that date. So I'm going to be picking Timothy Johnson in this fight. A little on Timothy Johnson is the number 15th ranked fighter in the UFC heavyweight division. So he is a ranked opponent. He's 11-4 overall. He's 3-3 in the UFC, Timothy Johnson is. He's alternated wins and losses his entire UFC career, so win-loss, win-loss, win-loss. And he's coming off of a first-round KO TKO loss to the big baby Junior Albini. So just going off of alternating wins and losses, he lost his last fight, he should be coming into a win. I mean, of course, that's not necessarily always the case, but Timothy Johnson has shown multiple times that he's capable of rebounding from a loss, and he'll also be fighting one of the most inexperienced guys he's fought in a while, as Golm's barely qualified to be in the UFC, let alone fighting a ranked opponent. But this is the heavyweight division, as I said, and anything can happen. So I got Timothy Johnson winning that fight. Next fight, Desmond Green versus Michael Prazeres. This is going to be an interesting fight. As far as entertainment value is concerned, it probably won't be the most entertaining fight of the night, as both of these guys are grapplers, but it's going to be a very interesting and a fun fight, as Desmond Green is 20-5 overall. It's funny, I've got a guy that I know in real life named Desmond Green, so and somebody that's actually more close to me, so that's just pretty funny. But either way, Desmond Green is 20-5 as a professional mixed martial artist, 1-1 in the UFC. He won his UFC debut versus currently top 5 ranked Josh Emmett, and then he lost his next fight via unanimous decision to the Russian grappler Rustam Khabilov. So Desmond Green is 1-1 in the UFC, and he's going to be fighting Michael Prazeres, who is at home. Michael Prazeres is 22-2, so a very nice UFC or mixed martial arts record, 7-2 in the UFC. I really low-key, I probably saw his last fight or the fight before, but Michael Prazeres is a guy that's 22-2 and low-key on a 5-fight winning streak in the UFC, and not many people know his name. That's pretty crazy. So I am going to be going with Michael Prazeres to win this fight. He should have an advantage on the mat, definitely, as far as jiu-jitsu is concerned. And Desmond Green was taken down 4 or 5 times, I believe, in his fight versus Rustam Khabilov, who was a dominant grappler. Now, Desmond Green is a wrestler himself, so it's not like he's just a slouch when it comes to wrestling, but he did get dominated in the wrestling department by Rustam Khabilov. But Michael Prazeres, not necessarily probably the wrestler that Rustam Khabilov is, where he lacks the wrestling, he definitely makes up for it in jiu-jitsu. And Michael Prazeres has still almost scored 5 takedowns in his last 4 fights. I mean, he's got like 7 takedowns in one fight, then 4, then 5, then 2. So Michael Prazeres definitely has some high-level grappling, and he's got a very nice mixed martial arts record to show for it. So I'm going to be picking Michael Prazeres in this fight, who's low-key on a 5-fight winning streak in the UFC, and he's won his last 2 fights via submission, and he's also scored, as I said, almost 5 takedowns in each of his last 4 fights. So Michael Prazeres should have the advantage on the mat in this fight, which is where this fight has a good chance of ending up. And he's also got more UFC experience in riding a 5-fight winning streak, and he's at home. So Michael Prazeres has a lot of things going for him. I'm picking him to win the fight. Now this fight right here, Valentina Shevchenko versus Priscilla Cachoeira. Woo, this fight is barely sanctionable. Valentina Shevchenko, one of my favorite, if not favorite, she's definitely one of my favorite female fighters on the planet, one of the best female fighters on the planet. And unless Amanda Cyborg is able to really put up a really a good fight against, unless Amanda Nunes puts up a good fight versus Chris Cyborg, Valentina Shevchenko is arguably the #1 pound-for-pound female fighter on the planet as far as multiple divisions. We saw she was super successful at bantamweight. Her only losses in the UFC were actually to Amanda Nunes, who's the bantamweight queen, and she lost twice to Amanda Nunes. And there's people that arguably thought Valentina Shevchenko won both of those fights. Not won both of those fights, but that she could have won both of those fights, as she was looking good in the 3rd round versus Amanda Nunes after losing the first 2 rounds. But the first fight was a 3-round fight, so if it was a 5-round fight, Valentina may have went on to win the fight, but she didn't. And then the championship fight versus Amanda Nunes also won that fight. So Valentina Shevchenko is probably a natural 125-pound female fighter that is really just better than even a majority of the 135-pound female fighters. But now she's going down to her natural weight class, as she used to fight in Muay Thai at 125 pounds. Actually has 4 wins over the strawweight queen Joanna Jędrzejczyk in Muay Thai at 125 pounds. So Valentina Shevchenko has fought at 125 pounds, even if not in the UFC. So she's going to be going down to a more natural weight class and fighting an undefeated Priscilla Cachoeira. Priscilla Cachoeira's pristine record is probably the only reason this fight got sanctioned. The only thing Priscilla Cachoeira really has going for her into this fight is she's fighting at home, sorta. She's fighting in Brazil and, making her UFC debut in Brazil. But Valentina Shevchenko 100% has more Brazilian fans than Priscilla Cachoeira. Valentina Shevchenko, I believe, speaks fluent Portuguese, used to live in Brazil, and she's just got a lot of fanfare over there as well as the rest of the world. So even though Priscilla, you might think, is at home, Valentina Shevchenko is probably going to be getting a majority of the cheers going into this fight. She was the #1 contender at 135 pounds, now coming down to 125 pounds, probably still the #1 contender. And a lot of people expect Valentina Shevchenko to become the 125-pound champion sooner rather than later. But first, she's got to make her 125-pound debut in the UFC versus Priscilla Cachoeira. And of course, anything can happen in mixed martial arts, but I'm not sure if that applies to this fight. No, it definitely applies to this fight. Anything can happen. Valentina can get caught in a submission or get dropped with a left hook. Of course it can happen. We've seen it happen. But I'll just say it's a very slim chance. I'm picking Valentina Shevchenko to win this fight. And it should be, I'm not going to say easy, but she should get it done rather... she shouldn't get hurt too bad in this fight. Whether she finishes her quick or it's just a one-sided unanimous decision, I'm not sure. But I think Valentina Shevchenko, is safe to say, is just on a way higher level than Priscilla Cachoeira at the moment. Priscilla's fights, yes, she's 8-0, but all of those fights were outside of the UFC, outside of Bellator, outside of Invicta. It wasn't like the Hypnotic Fighting Club or something. Like, it's crazy. And I believe her opponents were... I don't know, but yeah, with that being said, the UFC doesn't even have her picture up on the site. Nothing about her. Valentina Shevchenko should be walking through this fight. And if she loses, I think the whole world will be shocked. Now, with that being said, let's go into the co-main event. Arguably, possibly fight of the night. I mean, it's bantamweights. With bantamweights, it can be, especially John Dodson's last performance, if the punches aren't landing and there's just a lot of moving around and a lot of footwork and not as much punches landing, people might boo the fight at the end, which is what happened in John Dodson's last fight, where a lot of people thought his opponent was running from John Dodson. John Dodson said that as well, like, the guy kept running from me. Who was he fighting in his most recent performance? John Dodson, he fought John Lineker, and that was a split decision loss. Marlon Moraes. Okay, so a lot of people thought Marlon Moraes in John Dodson's last fight wasn't really engaging, and he was really trying to avoid John Dodson for a majority of the fight. But that led Marlon Moraes to winning the fight via split decision. But either way, John Dodson, man, is one of the most underrated fighters in the UFC, and that's just a fact, even if you do have him losing 2 of those. Because John Dodson right now is 2-2 at bantamweight. John Dodson started off in the UFC, actually started off at bantamweight. He knocked out TJ Dillashaw, the current bantamweight champion, in his UFC debut in the Ultimate Fighter finale. A lot of people don't know that fact. John Dodson did actually KO TJ Dillashaw. Some people say it was a little of an early stoppage. Either way, John Dodson went on to the flyweight division, and he was undefeated in the flyweight division to everybody not named Demetrius Johnson. It's kind of like Daniel Cormier at light heavyweight. He lost to he beat every single person that's not named John Jones. Well, John Dodson did that at bantamweight to everybody not named Demetrius Johnson. He lost to Demetrius Johnson twice and then moved up to back to bantamweight where he is now. John Dodson is 2-2 at bantamweight currently, but both of those losses are arguable and very close split decision losses. To Marlon Moraes and John Lineker, a lot of people had John Dodson winning both of those fights. So if he did win those fights, he would be 4-0 at bantamweight, and his only 2 losses in the UFC would still be to Demetrius Johnson in multiple weight classes. But the judges gave the fights to 2 of his opponents. So with that being said, John Dodson is now going to be fighting Pedro Munhoz, who's on a 4-fight winning streak in the bantamweight division. And Pedro Munhoz's only professional losses are to Jimmy Rivera, one of the top bantamweights on the planet, and also Rafael Assunção in his UFC debut, which he took on short notice. But when Pedro Munhoz did make his UFC debut, I believe he had an LFA or an RFA title, but he still took the fight on short notice and lost to Rafael Assunção. But he still got props for that fight, for taking it on short notice versus such a high caliber opponent. So Pedro Munhoz, man, he's got 4-fight winning streak, and 3 of those wins are performance of the night submission win bonuses. So Pedro Munhoz, he's definitely nothing to fuck with. 5-2 in the UFC. He's definitely got a good chance. When I was doing my research, I was doing the research on Pedro Munhoz first, and I was like, yo, I'm probably about to pick him to beat John Dodson. John Dodson is low-key one of my favorite fighters in the UFC, and I'm actually, you know, put a lot of respect on what he's done in the UFC, his UFC resume. But with that being said, Pedro Munhoz, his resume definitely impressed me. He's only lost to 2 killers, and he's also riding a 4-fight winning streak with 3 performance of the night bonuses in those. So Pedro Munhoz, number 10th ranked bantamweight in the world, 15-2 overall, 5-2 in the UFC. But I'm going to be picking John Dodson to win this fight. As I said, John Dodson's only 2 losses in the UFC are to Demetrius Johnson, the pound-for-pound #1 fighter on the planet. And, I mean, he's got those other 2 losses at bantamweight, but those were kind of arguable. And so with that being said, it's hard for me to pick against John Dodson. You really just haven't seen anybody be able to have a high level of success against him, except for the #1 P4P, Demetrius Johnson. So I'm picking John Dodson to get this win here, but I would not be surprised if he ends up getting submitted or losing this fight to Pedro Munhoz. But John Dodson's just one of my favorite fighters, and I'm going to be rooting for him as well. So he's got a very impressive resume, maybe even more impressive than Pedro Munhoz, as he's got a win over the current champion, TJ Dillashaw, first round KO TKO. John Dodson's one of my favorite fighters, one of the most underrated fighters, and he's also been getting robbed as of late in 2 of his split decisions. I mean, if he's going to lose both of the split decisions, you know what I'm saying, at least can he get one of them? Like, he arguably won them both, and he didn't get his hand raised in either or. And when I see that, I usually tend to like root for that person. So with that being said, John Dodson, I'm picking him to get the W, but I would not be surprised if he doesn't. Whew, the main event did not get any easier to call. Holy shit, the main event is hard for me to pick this fight. Lyoto Machida versus Eric Anders. Holy smokes, this is the great matchmaking, if not perfect matchmaking, because listen, Lyoto Machida is a legend of the middleweight division who's 39 years old and arguably on his way out the door. He's on a 3-fight losing streak, most recently getting KO'd by Derek Brunson, who is a, you know, athletic middleweight that can probably knock out anybody if he catches him clean. Now, we did just see Derek Brunson just get knocked out by Cachoeira over the weekend, but Derek Brunson's still nothing to fuck with. So with that being said, Lyoto Machida was knocked out by Derek Brunson, but Eric Anders is not Derek Brunson. Eric Anders is a lot less experienced in mixed martial arts, and as I said in the beginning of the video, transitioned from football to MMA. So he didn't come from the wrestling background or the boxing background or jiu-jitsu. It was from football. So he's not the most well-rounded. When he's in there, it looks a little sloppy. I mean, his takedown attempts look like he's tackling a cornerback or something. You know what I'm saying? In his last fight, when he was taking down his opponent, he was just like trying to drag him down. Once he had him on the ground, he didn't really have any chokes to try and lock in for his jiu-jitsu. It was more of a just having to, like, you know, just beat somebody down on the ground, hold them down and beat them down, because you don't really have the skills to submit them or even necessarily get the finish when you make it to the mat. And then as far as your striking is concerned, Eric Anders' striking is definitely going to need cleaned up. But as an athletic guy, a middleweight, of course, if he touches Lyoto Machida, he's got a chance to knock him out. He's also got a chance to, you know, kind of do what Chris Weidman did to Machida and control him with the wrestling. But the problem with that is Chris Weidman's wrestling is, I mean, it's just a fact, is on a whole nother level than Eryk Anders. Eryk Anders, you know, just because he scored 5 takedowns in his last fight, it's not because of his wrestling prowess as much of his athleticism, you know, which still means something. But I just think when you come, you know, this is going to be the most experienced opponent Eryk Anders has ever fought, and it would just be really weird to see a former football player being able to beat like a mixed martial arts legend. In my head, I could flip a coin and pick this fight, but I'm just going with MMA over football. In my head, it's like, yeah, Eryk Anders does have the potential, you know, very athletic guy, can probably take down and beat up a lot of people on this planet. But when it comes when you're talking about the best mixed martial arts fighters, I don't know about that, man. So this is why I'm picking Lyoto Machida. Eryk Anders is a step down in competition from a lot of the people Lyoto Machida has fought in the past, including Derek Brunson most recently. There's a lot of reasons, though, that I could pick Eryk Anders, as he's got age on his side, he's got the athleticism on his side, he's got USADA on his side. You know, Lyoto Machida was out due to a doping violation, but it wasn't like, I'm pretty sure he like told on himself, so it wasn't like he was like caught cheating. He was like, hey, I've been taking this, is this cool, or something like that. But either way, whatever happened with his doping violation, he's now back and USADA's still around. So with that being said, Eryk Anders does have some things on his side, so if he wins this fight, I wouldn't be surprised. And I'm also one of the people that believes these football players and these other athletes that start transitioning to MMA, I believe that wave is coming. There's a lot of guys, kind of the Greg Hardys, starting to fight amateur fights. There's professional football players and collegiate football players that are starting to transition and have some success in mixed martial arts. Eryk Anders could be one of those guys, as he's undefeated, but he's going to be going up against the toughest test and a former legend, well, a former champion and legend of the sport, Lyoto Machida. If Eryk Anders does get this victory over Lyoto, it's nothing but more sharks from here. He is looking to be fast-tracked to a title shot, I know that. So if he beats Machida, maybe one more big win, and he can get a title shot but I don't know. There's so many killers in the middleweight division. We just saw Cachoeira take out Brunson. Maybe if Anders beats Machida, it's Anders versus Brunson next. But holy smokes, man, that would just be crazy though if he was able to do it. So I wouldn't be surprised if Eryk Anders gets the victory, but I'm going to be picking Lyoto Machida to get the victory here. With that being said, man, that's my main card preview and predictions. So let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. I'm out.
Da 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 da! It's the motherfucking D-O-double-G!